They must have heard what this lesson was about. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I did a bad thing, and I forgot to give a big thank you to Hugh last time for teaching for me while I was out. So apologies, Hugh. I really do super appreciate you stepping in and doing that. So thank you, sir. All right, we are in Matthew 24 for the first time. And we ended chapter 23 with a little interpretation issues on the end of 23. And I got to tell you, we get to 24 and all I got are interpretation issues with 24. It was funny when I was talking to Zach about 23. We were going through it and he said, oh, by the way, when you get to 24, you're going to really have a problem. And now I know what he was talking about. Anyway, we'll get to that in a few minutes. So what we have here in 24 really is Jesus's teaching on the end times. And it's interesting when we talk about the end times, we go to Daniel, we go to Revelation, sometimes we go to the Thessalonians, right? But we don't often go here to Matthew. We did, I remember when we were in Revelations, we came here a couple of times, but it's not one of the places we often go. But it's interesting, this is what Jesus had to say about it. And it's for that reason, it seems like we ought to be paying more attention to it. Let's go back for a minute and remember where we were last week. Open my Bible, that's a good idea. So at the end of 23, let's just read from 37. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets, stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So essentially what Jesus is saying here is judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. And the next time you see me is when you see me as the Messiah, which may be when I come in glory. And this has got to trigger in the disciples' mind at this point. First of all, no way. No way is your house left to you desolate. There's no way that could happen. And then the other side of it was, oh, are you saying this is all going to happen now? Right? I think there's kind of a excited and terrified all at the same time when Jesus says your house is going to be left to you desolate. So let's get into it, and you'll see kind of how that turns as we get into the word. So in verse 1, it says, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and the disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. So remember again that this is that really long day, Wednesday. It started out with Jesus turning over the money changers, Jesus then doing the whoa, whoa, whoa kind of preaching to the Pharisees, having some discussions, again, ending with this judgment statement in the afternoon. Now he's left the temple. It's probably late afternoon at this point, but this has been a long day. I just want you to think about that. I mean, all that has gone on. And as he departs, this is the last time that he's in the temple. This is the last time that he visits there because, he is killed very shortly thereafter. And it's interesting here, it's, the disciples, it's verse 1 says, the disciples came up to him, showing him the buildings of the temple. Now, you do have to remember the temple was an awesome structure, right? I mean, it was beautiful. It was magnificent. It was, they say it was made with marble stones that were 70 feet in length, 10 feet high, 70 feet in length. I mean, how you move something like that, I have no idea. And of course, the top of it was all gilded with gold. They said from a distance, it just looked like a snow-covered mountain that just shone in the sun. And so as they're leaving, they are pointing out to Jesus, hey, you talked about this thing being left desolate, but do you see this? Do you see this place? Do you see how magnificent it is? In the parallel verses in Mark, the statement is, teacher, do you see what manner of stones and building are here? Do you see how wonderful and magnificent it is? In Luke, it says that it was adorned with beautiful stones and ornaments. So they were just kind of overwhelmed with the beauty and the magnificence of the temple. When he starts talking about it's going to be left desolate, they just can't believe this, right? How could this be left desolate? That's really what's behind their comments there. And then Jesus has this amazing response in verse 2. Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another, and shall not be thrown down. So this has got to just blow their minds, right? Again, 70-foot stones, 10 feet high. These stones, they can't even imagine how they were built, nevertheless, how they could be torn down, right? And so they're just, there's just two parts. One is just the physical reality of that. But secondly, this is the house of God to them, right? This is where God dwells. And that's going to be torn down. That's going to be left desolate. So historically, what happens? Right? Historically, in 70 AD, the Romans under Titus come in and they smash the place to bits, right? They tear down the temple. They actually dig up the stones and move them such that they were able to plow the dirt where the temple was. Now, this is historical. This is not in scripture, but you can go back and read the history of this time. And so, historically, this actually did happen. By the way, some people say, well, wait a minute, isn't there the Wailing Wall? Didn't they leave something there? And therefore, what Jesus said about, one stone upon another could not happen. One thing you need to understand, I didn't understand it, I looked into this, is that there was an original temple that was built by Zerubbabel in this place. When Herod came in, he decided to expand the temple and make it larger. And when he did that, the problem was that, if you remember, Jerusalem is on a hill on top of a mountain, if you will, and there wasn't really room for him to expand the temple. And so they had to build out the mountain. They had to add additional mountain, if you will. And so they had retaining walls around the mountain that were filled with dirt, upon which the new temple was expanded onto. What is left of the temple in Jerusalem right now is simply those retaining walls, okay? The Wailing Wall is simply a retaining wall. It's not part of the it's not part of the temple. It's not even part of the walls that surrounded the temple. It's just part of the retaining wall, if you will. Because again, all of the blocks were dug up and moved by the Romans because they wanted to make sure the Jews understood there was nothing left for them. And so again, just in the moment, though, the disciples are thinking, there's no way this can happen. There's no way when Jesus says, not one stone can be left upon another, they're going, that just can't happen. This is impossible. Now, before we get into more of this, the one thing to make sure you get the little mini lesson here, and that is the things that we're impressed by today, someday will be nothing. The things that we think are really amazing in the world today, someday will be nothing. One, because we're not going to be here, and two, because eventually they're not going to be here. And so if you're relying on something of this world, you're relying on something that's not immortal, not going to last. So there's a little mini lesson right there in verses 1 and 2. All right. Sorry, a little dry throat this morning. Let's go on to verse 3. Verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age." Now, first of all, they leave the temple, they go across the Kidron Valley and go up to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives was actually higher than the plain on which the Jerusalem set. I say plain, but it's the top of a mountain. The Mount of Olives is a mountain range, if you will. And so they go up to the top of the Mount of Olives, where you can actually have a full view of the city. You can see it from there. It's probably around near sunset, which would be the most beautiful time to view the city there as they look back over it. The disciples now finally ask the question that has been on their mind ever since they walked out, when they were showing him the rocks, and he then talks about, the stones are going to be torn down. And they finally ask the question that they really want to ask. By the way, Mark tells us that the asking was done by James, Peter, John, and Andrew, the first foursome of our group of 12 disciples, which would be normal. It probably was Peter who actually voiced the words because, it's Peter, right? Now, before I get into some details, let me just ask you one simple question, and that is, how many questions did they ask of Jesus?
At least two.
I'm just introducing silence to get you to read over it a couple of times. And the answer to the question is there's either one or two or three. Depending on your interpretation of his words, this is all one question, or there's two questions, or there's three questions. And honestly, this is a part of the interpretation question that we're going to get into in a little while, trying to clarify that. So first of all, but look at the first thing he says to them. It says, "Do you not see all these things?" Oh, I'm sorry, look in verse 2. The first disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" What are these things that they are talking about?
The previous verse where he said, "Not one stone will be left on another."
Right. The very obvious thing that he's talking about is the tearing down of the temple, right? When he's talking about when will these things be, they're saying, when is this tearing down of the temple going to be? Any other thoughts on that, though?
At the end of chapter 23, when he talks about, "You won't receive me again until every man says, 'Blessed be the name.'"
Right. When is that going to, when is the "blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord" thing going to happen, right? Yeah, that's another thing. Anything else? I would just take you back one verse to verse 38 in chapter 23, right? When will your house is left to you desolate come to happen, right? When is this this removal of God, right, going to happen? Is that already happened? Is that going to happen in the future? What is that? Okay. All right. So that's the first set of questions. Secondly, it says, "What will be the sign of your coming?" What will be the sign of your coming? What do they mean when they say you're coming?
I think they're coming into a position of triumph that they were expecting.
Yeah. So what's important here is they had no concept of a second coming, right? As we do. They weren't thinking, oh, you're going to leave, you're going to die, you're going to get resurrected, you're going to go back to heaven, and then you're going to come again later. They had no even though Jesus had pretty much told them that, right? Every time he told them that, they just kind of phased out and really had no clue what was going on. So they don't know anything about a second coming. When he talks about is coming, they're still thinking, is something going on, David?
Yeah, we got a radio show coming in that speaker. We're hearing them and you're in my right ear and.
It's coming in. Yeah, I don't know what it is.
Different speaker.
But it's gotta be,
If you turn the board down. is there-
that's what I was
The
thinking.
board is all the way down.
Is it?
Turn it off.
And I think you turn it off.
Well, but
Does that affect him?
the only thing it affects is my laptop is plugged into the power strip.
Well, but the power strip should be fine. I was just looking at the board.
This is plugged into the power strip, so.
You get that.
There's a power strip over there. Leave the power strip on. I'm talking about cutting.
Yeah.
The
You did.
board is
You
on
just
the-
did.
Turned it off. I mean, I see the amp is off.
Yeah, his power's off here, but is your laptop still on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Alright.
but it might run out of power before the end of class, but that's all right.
Okay.
It'll probably
I was
be.
thinking that was yours thing.
It's from the amp right there.
But that's what I was thinking.
Well, the power strip's plugged in the wall over there, so that,
Yeah.
But the soundboard is plugged into the power strip. So
yeah, but the soundboard is not supplying power to the power strip.
Leave
This
this
is all fascinating from our side.
if,
Knee bone's connected to the leg bone's connected to the foot bone.
Go ahead, Rich. I'm just looking for an on-off switch.
I asked them,
Is it
Bill
on?
and Rich, when
Right
we
there?
first got in here, if they
Alright.
could hear it. And they said, no.
No, I can't hear it.
I can't hear it.
It wasn't maybe my.
See,
phone.
this is the part they call
We got a name,
It just shows.
30-some odd years ago, so I couldn't hear him, so. He was-
It's not loud. He's must be louder.
There's lights.
It's okay.
Okay.
I think that's got it.
We should be good. I don't hear it anymore.
Yeah, now I'm hearing voices. Oh, maybe it's you guys.
Danny and I are hiding. Don't
Danny.
look for us.
Danny, before you leave, you got to remember to turn that back on.
Yeah, okay, we will. It's just very distracting.
Joe will appreciate that.
Yeah. I think it was funny you didn't hear them. Thank you.
Well, they told me they didn't hear it and I thought I was hearing things.
That's right. I'm the only one over here hearing, so.
All right, so the sign of your coming, again, his coming is not about the second coming. It's about, as Danny said, it's about him coming in the full as the Messiah, the way they expected it, right? When is your kingdom going to come? When are you going to take over? When are you going to defeat the Romans, right? That's what they're talking about. When is that going to happen, right? And then the last thing is, and the end of the age. What's the sign of the end of the age? Now, it is, again, this is dependent upon your interpretation of this, but normally when that phrase is used in Scripture, we've seen it before, by the way, just go ahead and turn back to Matthew 13. We see it there a couple of times in Matthew 13, verse 39. We had the parable here, the wheat and the tares. In verse 39, it says, the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels, right? The end of the age. And then go down to verse 49. And it says, so it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth, separate the wicked from among the just, right? So typically when we talk about the end of the age, you're really talking about end times. You're really talking about the final judgment. When Jesus has the final judgment. Now, in just for your reference, Luke 19:11, there it says the disciples thought all these things were going to happen immediately, right? That the temple being torn down, the second coming, or his fullness of his coming, the end of the age. When Jesus talked about these things, the disciples thought, man, that's all going to happen right now, right? It's right around the corner. So the primary thrust of Jesus's sermon, and really chapter 24 and chapter 25 are one sermon. It's called the Olivet Discourse. The primary thrust of this is for Jesus to say, no, it's not right now. This is not going to happen immediately. And really from verse 4 on to the end of end of chapter 25, he's answering these questions. And giving it, sometimes he's answering them with sermons, sometimes with parables, but all of it really is answering these questions. Now, the problem occurs in that there are several interpretations of chapters 24 and 25, and what are they talking about? And what I mean by that is, I asked Patty to write some things up on the board and for you guys to look at. So essentially the first interpretation, that these are three different interpretations of Matthew 24 and 25. The first interpretation is that from 24:3 to 25:46, in other words, all of chapter 24 and all of chapter 25 are about the final tribulation and the end times. This is a traditional conservative Baptist position, okay? That 24 and 25 are about the final tribulation and the end times. The second interpretation is that chapter 24, verse 3, where we are, to 24:34, and I'm going to show you that in a minute, pertain to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, which we just talked about, and that the rest of it, 24:35 through 25:46, are about the end of the age. I want you to turn to 24:34 a minute. It's kind of a key verse in this. 24:34, and you'll remember this verse. 24:34 says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." Right? So if you are in interpretation number 2, that means that the destruction of the temple is going to take place within this generation. Of course, you know, it happens 40 years later. Jesus is 30 at this point, right? We're at AD 30. The temple gets destroyed in AD 70. So it supports the idea that this generation is still alive when the temple is destroyed. So how does that jive with interpretation number 1? If this is all about the final tribulation and the end times? Well, the answer to that is what is meant by the word "this generation." If this generation means the generation that's alive at the tribulation, the generation that's alive at the end times, then this generation that they're talking about in these verses will not pass away until all these things take place. So that's the way people justify that interpretation with that kind of annoying verse. Now, interpretation number 3 is a relatively new interpretation, but it's getting a lot of steam in Christian circles, and so you need to see it and understand that there are people who believe this, and that is not only has the destruction of the temple already been fulfilled, all of the end times teaching, which is called eschatology, has been fulfilled, including everything in Revelation. Everything in Revelation has been fulfilled and everything has been done. All that's happening now are people are getting saved and they're going to heaven. They're getting saved and going to heaven. All the rest of this has taken place already. This is, by the way, called preterism. That's why I put that little word down there. That's that thinking. If you heard, I heard someone said that to me. I said, "What in the world is preterism?" But that is, it is essentially the idea of whatever you're teaching, if we believe that has already been fulfilled. And some people take it to this. This is the largest extent of this. If you think all eschatology has been fulfilled. Some people say, well, this piece has been fulfilled and that piece has been fulfilled. So they are partial preterists, if you will, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I thought you should at least know that. Mostly we're going to be talking about interpretations 1 and 2, but I want to make sure you understand all this. Now, so now let's get into verses 4 through 14 is what I want to try to get through today if we can, and we'll see if we do. I actually want to start at verse 8, which is right in the middle. Hold on a second, I'll be right back. And he's right back. All right, verse 8 says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. All these are the beginning of sorrows. And the word sorrows there, some of your translations may say birth pains. That is actually the word that is being used there. It's the beginning of the birth pains. And if you remember, those of you who remember such things or have heard of such things, birth pains in the beginning, they start out slow, right? Oh, what was that? Was that real? Was that not real? I'm not really sure. And then they rapidly increase and rapidly increase and rapidly increase until you decide, oh, it's time to go to the hospital. And then they rapidly increase until you actually have the birth, right? So what he's saying here is that these signs that I'm going to talk to you about or have talked to you about are the beginning of the birth pains, or the beginning of the these things, or the signs of your coming and the signs of the end of the age. So let's go back then to verses 4 and 5. So the first sign that he talks about is the sign of deception. So let's look at 4 and 5. Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will deceive many. So many will come to deceive you. And so he's saying in verse 5, they'll come and say, I am the Messiah. I am the Christ. I am come to, and so I am here, and it's time, right? Now, in interpretation number 2, where this is talking about the destruction of the temple, what the interpreters will say is that in the days following Jesus's death and resurrection, there were several Jews who stood up and said, hey, I am Jesus who has come back. I have come back from the dead. I'm back here on earth. It's time for you all to follow me. And these were just false messiahs. These were just false people who were claiming to be Christ. There were several of them that occurred in the early days of the ministry. In the interpretation number 1, this is talked about, if you remember very clearly in Revelation, saying at the end time there's going to be a multitude of false prophets. That really ends in the false prophet, right? That there will be many of these ending in the false prophet that the whole world follows in those days. And so this is again why there are 2 different interpretations of this depending upon how you're looking at this. If you're in the tribulation interpretation number 1, you certainly can understand that during the tribulation, if you believe the church has been removed, i.e. raptured, that also means the Holy Spirit has been removed, and the world has gone crazy with sin and nuts, and everyone then is looking for help. Everyone is looking for leadership, and these false prophets step up and say, hey, we can take care of you, we will show you the way, etc., etc. So it's not surprising that there are a lot of false prophets during this age, and that there are a lot of people that follow them. Well, let me just pause there. Am I freaking you guys out with the way I'm going through this, or are we okay? We okay? All right. It's freaking me out trying to teach this way, I gotta tell you that. All right, so let's go on to verses 6 and 7. Is that right? Yeah, verse 6 and 7. It says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So let's stop right there. The second sign is worldwide wars. Okay, if you remember in our study of tribulation, we saw this in spades, right? The king of the north will fight against the king of the south. The king of the east will fight, right? That we certainly saw this in Daniel, where there were nations, crushing into nations, so this is certainly true in the tribulation view. In the second view, where this is all about pre AD 70, obviously there was a lot going on also with wars between factions of people in the area. To say there was kind of worldwide war might be kind of a stretch. So it's anyway, there certainly were wars, if you will, between factions of people during that time. In the middle of this, right, he says, see that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Why is he telling them not to be troubled?
Part of the plan.
Yeah, it's part of the plan.
Got a lot of work to do before the end of the age.
Yeah. And again, going to verse 8, this is just the beginning stuff. Don't be troubled yet. And by the way, who's he talking to? Don't be troubled.
Believers.
What believers?
All believers, those that were present and those that are to come.
Wait a minute. So there's worldwide wars going on, and he's telling them not to be troubled. Who's there during these worldwide? I'm just taking let's take the view number one, right? We're in the middle of the tribulation here. In the middle of the tribulation, he's saying, don't be troubled. Who's he talking to?
Believers.
I think that depends a lot on your interpretation of the rapture. If you believe that the church has already been raptured before the tribulation, then he can't be talking to believers because all believers are in heaven. If the church has not been raptured, then yes, then he's talking to believers.
So this is the trouble we're in the middle of, right? So so as Bill has said very well, if the church has been raptured, then if the church has been raptured, let's just say that, are there any believers during the tribulation if the church has been raptured?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can
Yeah, there are actually. There are people who are saved during the tribulation.
What about the witnesses?
Right. You got the witnesses, you got the 2 witnesses, you got the 144,000 witnesses, right? You've got a lot of witnessing going on during the tribulation, even if the church is not there. And so there are believers during the tribulation, and that is perhaps who he's talking to, okay? And he's saying, don't be troubled, right? It's one, it's going to get worse, and we got a lot more to go, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. But yeah, these are converted Jews during this time, during the tribulation. All right. So the second sign then is these worldwide wars. Third sign is in the end of verse 7, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Right? Famines, earthquakes, and pestilence. Now, again, in view number 1, in the tribulation view, this is very obvious from what we've heard before, right? That the famines come, death comes, the world is essentially falling apart, and there are earthquakes all over the place. The earth is beginning to disintegrate, and again, this is just the beginning of things. Luke in this verse adds pestilence, fearful sights, great signs in the heavens. Again, which supports kind of the end times view or tribulation view of these verses. And again, also note that it says in various places, right? All over the place, these things are happening. For those who think this is about just about the temple, certainly there are earthquakes. There are people that are hungry. So they extend it in those kinds of senses. You can see there's a weakening of my opinion of interpretation number 2. But I'm giving you the truth. And what's interesting is, as I went through the commentaries, most of the commentaries are in interpretation number 2. They think that this whole first section is about the preparation, about what happens before the destruction of the temple. But interesting. All right, verse 9. So that's the third one, famines and earthquake. The fourth one is in verse 9. Then they will be delivered up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Right? You'll be delivered up to tribulation and kill you. They will deliver you up. When talk about they, they're talking about, again, the world. And more specifically, they're talking about the religious leaders. That'll be made clear a little bit later. But they will deliver you up into tribulation and kill you. You'll be hated by all nations, right? Persecution, widespread persecution is the fourth sign. Obviously, in the tribulation view, that is all over the place, right? Whoever gets saved during the tribulation are just going to be mocked. Are you kidding me? Right? This whole world is falling apart, and you are, you believe that something good is going on here. They're going to be persecuted. They're going to be ridiculed. They're going to be killed. They're going to be hated. In Mark, it adds they're going to be delivered up to the councils, i.e., the religious councils, which says that the religious leaders are in on this, in on the persecution of the believers during this time. Now, obviously, believers have been persecuted always and are being persecuted today. So those who want to believe that this is already being fulfilled, have that in their bucket to say, well, persecution is always going on. I think, however, you're talking about here a level of persecution that we've not seen before. Again, who are the people being persecuted? They are those who are saved during the tribulation. If you believe in a rapture, if you don't believe in a rapture, then they are Christians who are being persecuted during this time. All Christians. All right, so that's the fourth sign, persecution. The fifth sign begins in verse 10 and goes all the way down through verse 13. So let's read that. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Lost my place. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. So the next sign is really defection, if you will. I don't think that's as good a word as I can think of. Defection by the believers, right? So what has happened here in verse 10? Many will be offended and will betray one another and hate one another. Many will be offended. Many who have identified with Christ will turn back, will turn away. Many who have identified with Christ. They didn't say that they were saved or redeemed or Christians, but they've identified with Christ. You know that we have many of those people in the church today, right? Many who have identified with Christ, but are not really saved. So this is going to be the washing out, if you will, of those who are really saved from those who are not. Those who are willing to go through the persecution for Christ, described in verse 9, those who are willing to be killed for Christ, those who are willing to be hated by the nations, and those who are not, right? Those who are true believers and those who are not. Now, not only do they reject Christ, they also betray the true believers to the persecutors. They say, no, I'm not one of them. Hugh, I think Hugh is one of them. You should go after him, right? He's the one that ought to be persecuted, not me. In Mark, it says that brother will betray brother, father will betray child. It's why are they doing this? They think that in the midst of this persecution, this is the way out. This is the way to keep them from being persecuted. If they turn in somebody else, then they won't be persecuted. Then we have verse 11, which says, then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. So many are getting, are turning in brothers and family members and friends because they're trying to get out of persecution. Some of them are just deceived, right? They're just deceived by these false prophets into thinking that they're wrong, that Christ is not the way, that whatever this false prophet is teaching, that is the correct thing to do, right? And so they are simply deceived. So there's two reasons so far for this defection. One is to get out of the persecution. The second is that they're simply deceived by these false prophets. The third way in verse 12, it says, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. So again, if the rapture has happened, the Christians have left, the Holy Spirit has left, there's no tamping down of sin on the planet, right? And lawlessness is abounding. Lawlessness is all over. Sin is rampant. Evil is rampant. And the love of many will turn cold. In other words, people begin to desire sin because that's what everybody's doing. People are now controlled by sin, controlled by evil, because it's going on all around them. So, so again, people defect from this identification with Christ, first to get out of persecution, second because they're frankly just deceived by the false prophets, and then third because evil has just drawn them in. The evil is such a temptation in this days that they choose iniquity over Christ. But he adds in verse 13, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. Right? How can you tell those who are saved from those who are not saved? He who endures to the end shall be saved. He endures to the end. That's how you know that they are saved, right? And this is the same thing that we have said over and over again. How do you tell the difference between somebody who is just backsliding and someone who actually is apostate, someone who has left the faith? Well, those who stay to the end, that shows that they are saved. Or those that come back, that shows that they are saved. They do not turn away. And that's what he's saying here in verse 13. He who endures to the end shall be saved. So again, the fifth sign is this defection of Christians from the faith.
Rich, by endures to the end, is that the end of their life?
Yeah. So this is one of those interpretation questions. And one of the interpretations is exactly what you said, that they endure till the end of their life and therefore they are saved. Others indicate that no, he's talking about they endure until the end of the age. Now, I'm not sure what that means. If someone dies, right, and how they having to endure somehow while they're waiting for the end of the age, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I think it simply means endures to the end of their life, but it is not a settled thing in the commentaries, just to let you know. All right, so that's the fifth sign. The final and sixth sign is in verse 14. It says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. And again, if you're in interpretation number 2, where we're talking about the destruction of the temple, what they were saying is that, during these 40 years, everyone had heard about Jesus in the known world, in the Roman world, And so therefore that completes this idea that the preaching has been done to the whole world, and to all the nations. And if you talk about all the nations of the known world, right? And then the end will come, which is the destruction of the temple. In interpretation number one, obviously we're talking about preaching to the whole world. By the way, how does the preaching to the whole world, how is that possible? Anybody remember from our study of Revelation? Just for fun, turn to Revelation chapter 14. Please let Joe know that I'm saying Revelation, right? Revelation 14. All right, that's an inside joke, I guess. Revelation 14, verse 6. Here, we just heard about the Lamb and the 144,000 in the early part of verse 14, chapter 14. Chapter 14, now verse 6, it says, "Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him who made heaven and earth and the sea and springs of water." And then there's another angel, and then there's another angel. So there's angels who are flying around the earth, preaching the gospel to everyone on the earth during the tribulation, during the end times. So that is certainly how it is done, or how it could be done during that time. All right, so gosh, I got done almost early. How does that happen? So what's interesting here is, so we've got this three interpretations. And in all honesty, I'm going to probably just back up to interpretation number one as we get into verses 15 and following, because it's too hard for me to keep track of what interpretation am I talking about. But you should know that there are the interpretation as we go forward. What's interesting is if you look at the questions that Jesus asked all the way back in, the disciples asked all the way back in verse 3, right? Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? He answers the second question first. He talks about the signs here in verses 4 through 14, and then in verses 15, certainly through the end of verse 34, he's really talking about then the timing, and we'll see the timing really goes on verse 35, verse 36, etc. But so he first talks about the signs, then he talks about the timing. So we will be talking about the timing as we get into the rest of these verses. And of course, the timing is really highlighted in verse 36, right? But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But we're gonna be very. I'm gonna tell you exactly when it's going to happen. Yeah, these verses.
For number three, then, so those people that believe number three believe everything in the Bible has already come to pass.
Everything that's eschatological, yes, has already come to pass, right? All these things have come to pass. And so what they'll have an interpretation of when the sun turned to blood and when the heavens collapsed, right? And all being kind of a natural events that have already occurred, and that these are just flowery language for things that have already occurred, and that we shouldn't be looking forward to some kind of destruction, some kind of tribulation. That's just the tough stuff that we're going through now, and the tough stuff that's ongoing. And all that's really happening is that people are being saved and they're going on into heaven. There's no final things that will happen. Yeah. It's a little bizarre, but I need to bring it up because there are more and more people now who are beginning. Now, honestly, most of this is on the internet. There's not a lot of books written on this, but because I heard it in other places, I wanted to make sure you understood this out there. And again, hey, listen, I don't know what the right interpretation is. You may. I know people are very set in their interpretations on the end times things, as you recall from the time we spent in Revelation. But I know I'm kind of interested. I find it so. I guess the thing that is interesting to me and important to me, the thing that I believe. Let me say it that way. If we go back to the Old Testament and look at the prophecies in the Old Testament, they often had a near-term fulfillment and a long-term fulfillment, right? Things were going to happen, things happened soon thereafter, and they also were talking about things that would happen at the end times. I think that can be applied directly here to Matthew 24. That yes, there are things that could be applied to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and those same things can be applied to what's going to happen in the final tribulation. And I think if you take that attitude, you get out of this either or kind of situation that I think some commentaries have put themselves in, because I think the answer may be both, right? That he was talking about when the disciples asked him the question, tell us when these things will happen. I think he's saying, I'm going to give you signs for these things that will pertain to both what's going to happen in AD 70, because that obviously is an important event, but also apply to the final tribulation, what's going to happen then. So that's the Rich Antcliff interpretation of this, which is not up on your board. Anyway, which is not in any of the commentaries either, by the way, which is maybe I need to write a commentary. Oh, that's not happening. Anyways, anything else on this? Any more questions on this before we close it down?
One thing I'm in another study, we're looking at Peter. We're studying Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3. Peter talks a lot about his interpretation of the end time. So it's kind of interesting to look at that, because he was there hearing Christ, say these things,
Yeah.
and what the Lord revealed to him on the end time. So it's kind of interesting.
Right. And what's interesting is to think about, as you've said, Peter, John, in writing Revelation, Paul in writing the letters, Thessalonians, Galatians, etc., right? All of them heard Jesus say this, right? and then they have added some additional details, and through the Spirit giving them additional details. It's just interesting to think about it that way, which is not something I've thought about before. Right.
Oh, I was sorry, I didn't want to, but I think also he was when he was talking about false prophets, we had to be careful of folks that try to put dates and times to all this, and I think sometimes they can lead the church astray to focusing on those things and not. I'm sure we'll get into this later, but
Yep.
It's not whatever the scripture is about not useful or profitable for those discussions on those. But anyways.
I will say, Hugh, you'll find this humorous. In reading the stuff from the preterists, they all say, well, you people are just making this more complex than it is. All this stuff has already happened. We don't need to make up all this stuff that's going to go in the future, blah, blah, blah. So they're using that same argument, right? In the completely opposite way. So anyway. All right. Anything else then? All right, let's go to prayer requests. From our side, Joe is away at a women's retreat. She's coming back tonight. I've been all by myself for a couple of days, which is just scary, thing for it to be true. But anyway, I'm trying to get some things done. I got to clean the house now before she gets back, though. So y'all pray for me, pray for her travel. Seriously, pray for her travel as she comes back. That's all here, though, Hugh.
The back, David.
We're good. Mrs. Cecil says we're good.
All right.
I have a prayer request, making my 87-year-old mother, who never leaves the house except for a doctor's appointment, on a cruise.
Oh.
So,
That's
We-
great.
her Zoomer chair are gonna be off, not this week, but the following, so I'll see y'all next week, but just pray for her health that, seriously, for any length of time, she swells up like an elephant and all, and it could be a long week. I just pray that she always cruised with my dad. That was their thing when they were younger, and she said, I want to go on one more cruise. And Craig said, okay, I'm gonna plan it, and you're gonna be in the room with her. And him and Brenda are going to. So.
And remember Curtis, because he's gonna be home by himself.
No, he's not. We have grandkids that will need tending to. He's got a job to do. Pray for you.
Guess we're all good.